Jake Morrison stood at the huge window of his spaceship and looked out at the swirling clouds that had hidden Earth for 300 years. The clouds were not real clouds, but a wall of energy that his people had built long ago to hide their home from the rest of the galaxy. Today was the day they would turn it off and show the universe that humans were still alive behind Jake. His crew worked at their stations with quiet focus. Lisa Park sat at the communications desk, checking and double-checking the systems that would send their message across space. Her hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. This moment would change everything for their people. 300 years ago, the galaxy had watched Earth die, or so they thought. The alien races had seen massive explosions and energy readings that looked like a planet destroying itself. What they did not know was that humanity had chosen to disappear. The leaders of Earth had made a hard choice when they realized that their world was not ready to face the dangers that lived. Among the stars, Jake remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about those early days when humans first met aliens. The galaxy was ruled by fear and power, and Earth was just a small, weak planet that no one cared about. Wars happened all the time between different alien races, and smaller worlds like Earth were often destroyed or enslaved. The human leaders saw what was coming and decided to buy time. The best scientists and engineers on Earth had worked together to create the energy barrier that would hide their solar system. To the outside galaxy, it looked like Earth had exploded in some terrible accident. The aliens marked Earth as dead in their records and forgot about the small blue planet. But inside the barrier, humanity was very much alive and working harder than they ever had before. Jake had grown up hearing about the great work, as people called it. Every human alive had spent their entire lives building toward this day. Children learned advanced science before they could read properly. Adults worked on projects that would take decades to finish. The old people shared their knowledge and died knowing that their children would continue the work. Earth had changed beyond recognition during those 3 centuries. The planet now had rings of metal around it filled with factories and defensive weapons. Space stations the size of cities floated in orbit around every planet in the solar system. Ships that could bend space and time sat in hidden docks waiting for orders. Humanity had not just survived, they had become something new. Lisa turned to face Jake and nodded. All systems were ready. The quantum communication arrays were online and waiting to broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. The defensive platforms were charged and ready. The fleet was in position. Everything they had worked for over 3 centuries was about to begin. Jake thought about his ancestors who had made the choice to hide. They had known that their children would have to live in secret, working and building and preparing for a day they might never see. But they had also known that when humanity finally revealed itself again, they would not be the weak species that had once begged for scraps from alien empires. They would return as equals or better. The energy barrier began to fade as Jake gave the order. Slowly, the swirling clouds of false nebula dissolved into space, revealing the Sol system in all its transformed glory. Where once there had been a simple star with a few rocky planets, there now stood a fortress that could challenge any power in the galaxy. Earth itself glowed with the light of thousands of orbital platforms. Mars had been covered in domed cities that sparkled like jewels in the sunlight. The asteroid belt had been turned into a massive shipyard where vessels larger than alien space stations floated in construction docks. Jupiter and Saturn wore rings of metal and energy that could be seen from light years away. But the most impressive sight was the fleet that emerged from hidden bases throughout the system. Ships that seemed to bend light around their hulls appeared in perfect formation around Jake's command vessel. Each ship was a masterpiece of human engineering powered by technologies that the galaxy had never seen. They moved without visible engines, and their weapons could destroy matter at the level of atoms. Jake walked to his command chair and sat down, knowing that thousands of people across the system were watching and waiting for his next words. The communication systems connected him to every human settlement from Earth to the edge of their solar system. Presidents and generals and scientists and workers all waited to hear him speak the words that would announce humanity's return. Lisa opened the channels that would carry their message to every alien world and space station in the galaxy. The signal would take time to reach the farthest corners of known space, but when it arrived, it would be impossible to ignore. Advanced quantum transmitters would make sure that every radio receiver and communication device would pick up their broadcast. The bridge fell silent as Jake prepared to speak. He thought about all the generations who had worked in secret for this moment. He thought about his parents who had died building the ships he now commanded. He thought about his children who would grow up in a galaxy where humanity stood proud and strong. He thought about all the alien races who had written off Earth as dead and forgotten. Jake activated the communication system and spoke in a clear, steady voice that would be heard across the galaxy. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of 3 centuries of human determination and the promise of a new age for all thinking beings who valued freedom and justice. The message went out into space, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of an entire species. Humanity had spent 300 years in silence, learning and building and preparing. Now they would speak, and when they spoke, it would be with a voice that no power in the galaxy could ignore. The age of hiding was over, and the age of human strength had begun. Behind Jake, the crew worked to monitor responses from across the galaxy. Soon, alien governments would receive their transmission and realize that humanity was not only alive but had become something they never expected. The small, weak species that had once begged for acceptance had transformed itself into a force that would reshape the balance of power among the stars. The great council chamber of the Galactic Assembly erupted in noise and confusion as the impossible readings from Earth appeared on every screen and display. Ambassador Zektar of the Vrex people stared at the energy signatures that showed power levels beyond anything in their scientific databases. His scaled hands shook as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Council Speaker Thyma stood at the center of the chamber, her crystal body flashing with colors that showed her distress and disbelief. Around her, representatives from dozens of alien species argued and shouted in their native languages, while translation computers struggled to keep up with the chaos. The holographic displays showed ships and structures that defied everything they knew about physics and engineering on Earth. President Alex Stone sat in the emergency command center deep beneath the rebuilt city of Denver. The room was filled with the most important people in human government and military. General Patricia Hayes stood at the main display showing real-time intelligence about the galaxy that humanity was about to rejoin. Her weathered face was grim as she explained what their long-range sensors had detected. The galaxy had changed during the 3 centuries of human isolation, and not for the better. Old alliances between alien races had crumbled under pressure from aggressive empires. Peaceful species had been conquered or destroyed. Trade routes that once connected different worlds had been cut by pirates and warlords. Most troubling of all was the rise of the Kethmore Dominion. General Hayes pointed to the red zones on the galactic map that showed Dominion territory. The Kethmore had started as a minor species from a desert world, but over 2 centuries they had built an empire that now controlled nearly 1/3 of known space. They ruled through fear and brutality, turning conquered populations into slaves and resource extraction centers. The Dominion military was vast and cruel. They used weapons designed to cause maximum suffering rather than quick death. Their prison planets held billions of beings from hundreds of different species. Children were taken from their families and trained as soldiers. Entire worlds had been strip-mined until nothing remained but dead rock and poisoned air. President Stone listened to the reports with growing anger. The human leadership had hoped to return to a galaxy where peace and cooperation had grown during their absence. Instead, they found a universe where the strong preyed upon the weak, while the old Galactic Assembly debated and passed meaningless resolutions that no one enforced. Alex Stone was a tall woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering in her long career. She had been born on one of the outer colonies during the building years when every human settlement focused on preparing for this day. Her parents had been engineers who died in an industrial accident while constructing the great defensive platforms. She had dedicated her life to making sure their sacrifice meant something. The president turned to face the assembled leaders of humanity. These were not the frightened refugees who had once hidden from alien powers. These were the descendants of people who had spent 300 years building something magnificent and terrible. They had the power to reshape the galaxy and the will to use it. General Hayes continued her briefing with details that made everyone in the room angry. The Dominion did not just conquer worlds, they broke them. Species that resisted were hunted to extinction. Those that surrendered were worked to death in mines and factories. The Kethmore had turned slavery into an industrial process that consumed entire civilizations. The general showed images captured by hidden human scout ships that had been watching the galaxy for decades. Cities burned while alien soldiers rounded up civilians. Children cried over the bodies of their parents. Beings who had once been free and proud now wore chains and moved with the broken posture of the defeated. The scenes were hard to watch but necessary to understand. President Stone stood and walked to the center of the room. The weight of command had aged her, but her voice was still strong when she spoke. She had made difficult decisions before during the final stages of construction, when resources were scarce and time was running short. But this decision would affect not just humanity, but every thinking being in the galaxy. The choice was simple in concept, but enormous in scope. Humanity could reveal itself slowly and try to work within the existing galactic order. They could attempt diplomacy and negotiation with powers that had spent centuries perfecting the art of oppression. They could try to change a system that had failed billions of innocent people, or they could do what humans had always done when faced with bullies and tyrants. They could stand up and fight back with everything they had built during their long isolation. They could use their advanced technology and unified purpose to break the chains that bound so many worlds. They could become the force for justice that the galaxy desperately needed. Alex Stone made her choice, with the certainty of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. She turned to the communication officers and gave them orders that would echo across space and time. The message would go out on every frequency to every world that could receive it. It would be translated into thousands of languages and broadcast until everyone heard it. The transmission that left Earth was simple, but it carried a promise that would terrify some and give hope to many others. The words were chosen carefully to convey strength without arrogance and determination without cruelty. When alien governments received the message, they would understand that the galaxy had a new player and the old rules no longer applied. Lisa Park sat at her communication station on Jake Morrison's ship and coordinated the broadcast. With stations across the Sol system, the message would be sent from multiple points to make sure it could not be blocked or jammed by hostile forces. Advanced human technology ensured that every radio telescope and communication array in the galaxy would pick up their signal. The words that went out into space were spoken by President Stone herself in the calm, confident voice of someone who had the power to back up her promises. She spoke of Earth's return and the changes that would follow. She offered hope to the oppressed and delivered a warning to their oppressors that could not be ignored. Across the galaxy, alien leaders received the transmission with reactions that ranged from disbelief to terror. Some tried to dismiss it as a hoax or mistake. Others immediately began analyzing the technology that could broadcast across such distances with such clarity. The smart ones started making plans to either surrender or run before humanity arrived. The Dominion's response was swift and predictable. Supreme Commander Vorthak received the message in his fortress on Kethmore Prime and laughed at what he saw as the empty threats of a dead species. He had conquered hundreds of worlds and enslaved billions of beings. The idea that extinct humans could threaten his empire seemed like a joke. But as intelligence reports arrived, showing the massive energy signatures from Earth's solar system, Vorthak began to realize that humanity's return was real and dangerous. He gathered his generals and admirals to plan a response that would crush this new threat before it could interfere with Dominion expansion. Supreme Commander Vorthak stood in his war room surrounded by holographic displays showing the might of his Crimson Fleet. 1,000 of the most advanced warships in Dominion space hung in perfect formation, awaiting his orders to destroy the upstart humans who dared challenge his empire. Each vessel was 5 times larger than anything in the old galactic assembly fleets and armed with weapons that could crack planets. The Kethmore commander was a massive being, covered in natural armor plates that had been enhanced with metal implants and battle scars. His people were warriors by nature and had built their empire through superior firepower and absolute ruthlessness. Vorthak had personally led the conquest of 47 worlds and killed millions of beings who refused to surrender. To Dominion Rule Captain Sam Rodriguez received the intelligence reports about the approaching enemy fleet while standing on the bridge of his ship, the Retribution. The human vessel was sleek and elegant compared to the brutal angular design of Kethmore warships. It was also much smaller, with a crew of only 200 compared to the thousands of soldiers that packed each Dominion. Battleship Sam was a young officer who had been born and raised on one of the orbital platforms around Mars. His parents had been part of the generation that perfected human shield technology, and his sister worked in the quantum weapons division on Europa. Like every human alive, he had spent his entire life preparing for the day when their species would face the galaxy as equals. The human response fleet consisted of only 50 ships, but each one represented 3 centuries of scientific advancement and engineering innovation. They carried weapons that could manipulate matter at the atomic level, and shields that could absorb enemy fire and convert it into power for their own systems. Most impressive of all were the artificial intelligence, systems that could process information and make decisions faster than any biological mind admiral. Kate Morrison commanded the human fleet from her flagship, the Earth's Will. She was Jake Morrison's younger sister and had followed in his footsteps by joining the space service at the earliest possible age. Her tactical genius and calm leadership had earned her rapid promotion through the ranks until she became the youngest flag officer in human history. The two fleets met in the empty space between star systems, where their battle would not endanger civilian populations. Long-range sensors showed the Dominion ships approaching in a massive wedge formation, designed to concentrate maximum firepower on a single point. Their weapons were already charging, and their commanders were confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm. The small human force Captain Rodriguez studied the tactical displays and felt no fear or doubt about the coming engagement. Human war games and simulations had prepared them for exactly this situation. Their ships were designed to fight against overwhelming odds using speed and technology, rather than brute force. Every crew member knew their job and trusted their equipment. The Kethmore fleet opened fire first with massive energy beams that could vaporize mountains and plasma torpedoes that burned hotter than star cores. The barrage was so intense that it lit up space like a second sun and would have destroyed any conventional fleet in seconds. The aliens expected to see human ships disappear in balls of superheated gas. Instead, the human vessels seemed to absorb the incoming fire without taking any damage at all. Their revolutionary shield systems converted the attack energy into power that made their own weapons stronger. The Dominion commanders watched in disbelief as their most powerful weapons actually made the enemy more dangerous. Sam Rodriguez gave the order to return fire, and the human fleet demonstrated technology that the galaxy had never seen before. Quantum torpedoes simply unmade enemy ships at the molecular level, causing them to dissolve into component atoms. Energy beams that could exist in multiple dimensions struck targets that thought they were safely hidden behind other vessels. The battle lasted 4 hours, but the outcome was decided in the first few minutes. When it became clear that human technology was centuries ahead of anything the Dominion possessed, enemy ships exploded or simply vanished as human weapons found ways to bypass every defense. The Crimson Fleet that had conquered dozens of worlds was systematically destroyed, without inflicting a single casualty on their attackers. Admiral Morrison watched the tactical display as the last enemy vessel was eliminated. Her fleet had not even moved from their original positions during most of the engagement. The artificial intelligence systems had identified threats and eliminated them with mechanical precision, while human crews monitored the systems and made strategic decisions. The most shocking moment came when several human ships appeared to be in multiple locations at once. Advanced spatial manipulation technology allowed them to exist in several points in space simultaneously and attack from angles that should have been impossible. Physics, as the galaxy understood it, simply did not apply to human engineering. Captain Rodriguez transmitted his after-action report back to Earth with clinical precision. Enemy vessels had operated using technology and tactics that were hundreds of years out of date. Their weapons were crude and ineffective against human defenses. Their ships were large but slow and vulnerable. He recommended studying captured enemy equipment for historical interest. Only news of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than the speed of light, thanks to quantum communication networks that most species did not fully understand. Video recording showed human ships moving like dancers while enemy vessels exploded around them. The impossible had happened, and everyone wanted to know how alien military leaders studied the footage with growing alarm. The humans had not just won, they had made the fight look easy. Ships that could shrug off planet-killing weapons and respond with attacks that defied known science represented a level of advancement that changed everything. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in a matter of hours. On Kethmore, Prime Supreme Commander Vorthak received the news of his fleet's destruction with rage and disbelief. The Crimson Fleet had been the pride of his military, and its loss left a massive gap in Dominion defenses. But more than that, it showed that humanity possessed weapons and defenses that made his empire's military supremacy meaningless. Their Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session as representatives from dozens of species tried to understand what they had witnessed. The energy readings from the battle defied analysis, and the weapon signatures matched nothing in their databases. Some delegates suggested attempting immediate diplomatic contact, while others proposed military alliances against the human threat. President Stone received the battle reports in her command center and felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride because her people had proven themselves capable of standing against any threat in the galaxy. Sadness because she knew this was only the beginning and many more battles would follow before true peace could be achieved. The demonstration of human military power had served its purpose by showing the galaxy that Earth's children were no longer weak refugees begging for protection, but it also meant that every government and military leader in known space would be making plans to either ally with humanity or find ways to destroy them before they became too powerful. General Hayes updated the strategic assessments as intelligence flowed in from across the galaxy. Some species were already attempting to make contact and offer alliances. Others were clearly preparing for war. The Dominion was mobilizing its reserve fleets and calling in forces from conquered worlds. The next phase of humanity's return would require careful planning and decisive action. Dr. Emma Foster stood before the United Earth Assembly holding a datapad that contained 3 centuries of xenobiological research. Her team had spent decades studying every known alien species using information gathered by hidden observation posts throughout the galaxy. What they had discovered would shape humanity's strategy for the liberation campaign that everyone knew must come. Emma was a tall woman with prematurely gray hair who had dedicated her life to understanding the diverse forms of life that existed among the stars. Her parents had been part of the first generation of scientists who studied alien biology, from captured specimens and intercepted communications. She had continued their work with resources and technology that earlier generations could never have imagined. The assembly hall was packed with representatives from every human settlement in the solar system. Military officers sat beside civilian leaders while scientists and engineers filled the observer sections. Everyone understood that the decisions made here would determine not just humanity's future but the fate of billions of enslaved beings across the galaxy. Emma activated the holographic display system and began presenting her findings about the 47 species currently under Dominion control. Each alien race had been studied in detail, from their biology and psychology to their history and cultural values. The research showed that most of these species were naturally peaceful and had been conquered through superior firepower rather than any aggressive tendencies. Genti people of Kepler 442b were a perfect example of Dominion brutality. They were a gentle species that had never developed weapons of war because their planet had no large predators, and their society was built around cooperation and mutual aid. When the Kethmore arrived 2 centuries ago, the Genti had no way to resist and were quickly enslaved. Emma showed images of Genti labor camps where millions of the butterfly-like aliens toiled in mines and factories, under conditions that slowly killed them. Their wings had been clipped to prevent escape, and their children were taken away to be raised as servants in Kethmore households. A species that had once created beautiful art and music now lived only to serve their cruel masters. Admiral Chris Parker stood to address the assembly when Emma finished her presentation. At 35, he was the youngest flag officer in human history, and had earned his rank through brilliant tactical innovations during the fleet exercises that prepared humanity for this moment. His plan for the liberation campaign was as elegant as it was devastating. Chris activated a different holographic display that showed the strategic layout of Dominion space. Red zones indicated heavily fortified military installations, while yellow areas marked enslaved populations that could be freed with minimal collateral damage. Blue arrows showed the proposed routes that human liberation fleets would take through enemy territory. The liberation campaign would not attempt to conquer and hold Dominion worlds. Instead, it would focus on breaking the control systems that kept billions of beings in slavery and giving freed populations the tools they needed to defend themselves. Human ships would strike quickly at command centers and military installations before departing to their next target. Admiral Parker explained that each liberation fleet would consist of a single human vessel, equipped with the most advanced weapons and construction systems that their technology could produce. These ships could destroy enemy installations with surgical precision while simultaneously deploying defensive platforms and communication arrays for the newly freed populations. The first target would be Kepler 442b, where the Genti people had suffered under Dominion rule for 2 centuries. Intelligence reports showed that the planet was lightly defended because the aliens there had never shown any ability to resist their oppressors. A single human ship could free the entire world in a matter of hours. Commander Ryan Bell received the assignment to liberate the Genti homeworld and accepted it with the quiet determination that characterized all human officers. He was a veteran of the deep space missions that had mapped Dominion territory during the years of hidden preparation. His ship, the Liberation, was equipped with the most advanced technology humanity had developed. The Liberation dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system and immediately began broadcasting on all frequencies. In the Genti language, Ryan's message was simple and direct, informing the enslaved population that help had arrived and asking them to move away from military installations that would soon be destroyed. Dominion sensors detected the human ship within minutes, but the alien commanders were not particularly concerned. A single vessel, no matter how advanced, could not threaten an entire planetary occupation force. The Kethmore garrison began moving their ships into attack formation, while ground-based weapons prepared to fire on any vessel that approached the planet. What happened next became legendary among the liberated worlds and a source of terror for Dominion forces everywhere. The Liberation used weapons that could exist in multiple dimensions to strike every military installation on the planet simultaneously. Orbital defense platforms simply dissolved into their component atoms, while ground bases disappeared without explosions or debris. The entire Dominion garrison was eliminated in less than 6 hours without a single civilian casualty. The Liberation then deployed construction drones that built defensive platforms around the planet and communication arrays that would allow the Genti to contact other freed worlds. The human ship departed with a simple message about freedom and the tools to maintain it. Word of the Genti liberation spread through the underground networks that connected enslaved populations across Dominion space. Species that had lived without hope for generations suddenly began to believe that freedom might be possible. Secret messages passed between worlds carrying news that someone was finally fighting back against their oppressor's planet after planet was liberated using the same devastating tactics. Human ships would appear without warning, eliminate all military forces and infrastructure, then depart, leaving behind defensive systems and communication networks. The freed populations were given technology that was decades ahead of anything the Dominion possessed, but was deliberately designed to be easy to understand and maintain. The Corvani mining worlds were freed when the human ship Justice eliminated their orbital slave processing stations and provided the insectoid workers with equipment that could turn their mining operations into defensive fortifications. The Talian agricultural colonies received technology that could feed their populations while producing materials for weapons and armor. Each liberation followed the same pattern but was customized for the specific needs and capabilities of the species being freed. The humans had studied every enslaved race for decades and understood exactly what each group would need to maintain their independence once Dominion forces tried to reconquer them. Supreme Commander Vorthak watched his empire crumble as world after world slipped from his control. His response fleets would arrive at recently liberated planets only to find empty space where their installations once stood, and alien populations armed with weapons that could destroy Kethmore battleships. The technology gap had made conventional military responses useless. The liberation campaign accelerated as more human ships joined the effort. What had started as a single vessel freeing one world became a coordinated offensive that struck dozens of targets simultaneously. Dominion forces found themselves fighting an enemy that could be anywhere and everywhere while remaining impossible to locate or destroy. General Hayes monitored the campaign from her command center on Earth and marveled at how quickly the Dominion was collapsing. Centuries of oppression were being undone in months by a strategy that combined overwhelming technological superiority with precise surgical strikes. The enslaved populations were doing most of the work themselves once they had the tools to fight back. The psychological impact of the liberation campaign was as important as its military effectiveness. Dominion forces that had once terrorized entire sectors now lived in fear of human ships that could appear without warning. Enslaved populations that had accepted their fate for generations suddenly found the courage to resist and fight for their freedom. Supreme Overlord Draxeth stood on the observation deck of his palace on Kethmore Prime and watched the largest human fleet ever assembled appear at the edge of his home system. 200 ships that bent light around their hulls materialized from hyperspace in perfect formation, like harbingers of his empire's final judgment. For the first time in his long, violent life, the ruler of the Dominion felt genuine fear. Seth was ancient even by Kethmore standards, having lived for over 4 centuries and conquered more worlds than any other leader in his species' history. His body was more machine than flesh after countless battles, and his mind held the memories of billions who had died at his command. He had built an empire that spanned a third of the galaxy and ruled over species that had once thought themselves untouchable. The human fleet did not attack immediately, which surprised everyone in the Dominion Command Center. Instead, they maintained their position at the system's edge while a single ship detached from the formation and approached Kethmore Prime under a flag of truce. The vessel was larger than the Kyr. Others and broadcast diplomatic codes that had not been used in the galaxy for centuries. President Alex Stone sat in the command chair of the flagship Earth's Will and reviewed the intelligence files about the being she was about to confront. Draxeth had ruled the Dominion for over 2 centuries and was personally responsible for the deaths of more sentient beings than any other individual in recorded galactic history. She felt no hatred for him, only a cold determination to end his reign of terror. The diplomatic protocols were a formality that humanity felt obligated to observe. Alex had no intention of negotiating with a tyrant, but she wanted the galaxy to see that Earth's children offered mercy even to their worst enemies. The message she transmitted directly to the Overlord's palace was simple and gave him one last chance to avoid total destruction. Seth received the human president's ultimatum in his throne room, surrounded by his generals and advisors. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. The Dominion would surrender unconditionally and release all enslaved populations. Kethmore military forces would lay down their arms and submit to human authority. War criminals would be turned over for trial and judgment. The Overlord's response was as predictable as it was futile. He rejected the human demands and ordered his remaining fleets to defend the homeworld at all costs. Thousands of Kethmore warships emerged from hidden bases throughout the system, while planetary defense platforms charged their weapons. If the Dominion was going to die, it would die fighting. Admiral Kate Morrison commanded the human fleet from her position on the Earth's Will Bridge and watched with professional interest as enemy forces moved into defensive positions. 3 centuries of preparation had led to this moment when humanity would demonstrate that some technologies were so advanced they seemed like magic to those who did not understand them. When the deadline President Stone had given expired, Admiral Morrison did not order her fleet to attack. Instead, she activated weapon systems that made all previous human technology seem primitive by comparison. The demonstration that followed would be remembered as the moment when the galaxy truly understood what humanity had become during their long isolation. Every weapon system on Kethmore Prime simply stopped working. Energy rifles became useless metal tubes while plasma cannons went dark and cold. Missile launchers found their projectiles transforming into harmless dust, while shield generators powered down despite having full energy supplies. The planet's entire military infrastructure became as useful as ancient stone tools. The effect was not limited to weapons. Every computer system throughout the Dominion began displaying the same message in hundreds of different languages. Communication networks that had carried orders from the Overlord's palace for centuries now broadcast only words of liberation and hope. Even personal devices in the hands of individual soldiers showed the same. Draxeth watched in horror as his empire's entire technological foundation was quietly taken over by human artificial intelligence systems. The computers that controlled everything from life support to transportation were no longer under his command. His palace guards found their armor locked in place while their weapons refused to fire. Even when manually triggered, the message that appeared on every screen throughout Dominion space was carefully crafted to reach both the oppressors and the oppressed. It informed Kethmore forces that their war was over and resistance was futile. It told enslaved populations that they were free and no longer needed to fear their former masters. It promised protection for the innocent and justice for the guilty commander. Linda Wright led the boarding party that entered the Overlord's palace through walls that human technology made as permeable as air. Her team moved through corridors filled with confused and terrified Kethmore soldiers whose weapons and armor had become useless decorations. The ancient stronghold that had never been breached fell without a shot being fired. Linda found Draxeth in his throne room, still trying to give orders to subordinates who could no longer hear his voice through communication systems that had been reprogrammed by human AI. The sight of the tyrant reduced to shouting at silent screens might have been pathetic if not for the billions who had suffered and died at his command. The Overlord's final question before his capture revealed the depth of his confusion and fear. He asked what humanity had become during their centuries of isolation, and Linda's answer was both simple and profound. Humans were what happened when a species decided that freedom was not negotiable and had the time and resources to build the tools necessary to enforce that decision. The capture of Draxeth marked the end of the Dominion as a political entity, but the work of liberation was far from over. Human administrators and engineers spread throughout former Dominion space, helping freed populations establish new governments and defensive systems. The transition from slavery to freedom required careful planning and massive resources. Ambassador Peter Gray stood before the reformed Galactic Assembly 5 years after the fall of the Dominion, and looked out at representatives from species that had once lived in chains. The Genti delegates' wings sparkled with natural colors that had been hidden under decades of forced clipping. The Corvani representative moved with the confident grace of a being who no longer feared arbitrary punishment. The Assembly chamber itself had been rebuilt using human architectural principles that emphasized openness and equality, rather than the hierarchical structures that had dominated galactic politics for millennia. Every species had an equal voice regardless of their military power or economic resources. Decisions were made based on justice and mutual benefit, rather than fear and intimidation. Peter's speech to the Assembly was the culmination of everything humanity had worked toward during their long preparation. The Charter of Universal Rights that he presented was based on principles that his species had developed during their centuries of growth and reflection. It guaranteed freedom and dignity for all sentient beings while providing mechanisms to prevent future tyranny. The vote on the charter was unanimous, but that was not surprising given that most of the Assembly delegates represented worlds that had been liberated by human intervention. What mattered more was the commitment these species made to defend each other against any future threats. The age of galactic empires built on oppression was ending. President Stone received reports from across the former Dominion territory, showing the remarkable progress that had been made in just 5 years. Worlds that had been stripped bare by centuries of exploitation were rebuilding their ecosystems with human environmental technology. Species that had nearly gone extinct were recovering their populations in protected habitats. The military situation had stabilized as well, with former Dominion worlds forming mutual defense pacts that were backed by human technology and training. Local defense forces equipped with advanced weapons and shielding could now stand against any conventional threat. The galaxy had achieved a balance of power that favored freedom over tyranny. Jake Morrison retired from active service and returned to Earth, where he often stood, at the same window where he had watched the energy barrier fall 5 years earlier. The view was different now, with ships from dozens of species coming and going from human space stations. Trade and cultural exchange flourished between worlds that had once been enemies or strangers. The transformation of the galaxy was not complete, and probably never would be. New challenges would arise and new threats would emerge that would test the alliance between free worlds. But humanity had proven that with enough determination and preparation, a single species could change the balance between oppression and liberty. Among the stars, the long silence was over, and humanity had indeed spoken with power. But more importantly, they had used that power to lift up others rather than conquer them. The galaxy had listened to their message of freedom and hope, and had chosen to build something better than what had come before.